Hello, everyone, and welcome to Novara Live. I'm your host, Dalia Gebrial, and joining me today is babe and very dear friend of the show, Helena NoJusticeMTG. Helena, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Good to join you for our first Novara Live together within the new year. I hope the new year is treating you well so far, Dalia.
Coming up on tonight's show, we'll take a closer look at the ceasefire deal agreed between Israel and Hamas. We've got two expert guests to speak about the geopolitical ramifications of the deal and what it means for Palestine's future. And later in the show, we'll look at the new grooming gangs inquiries announced by Yvette Cooper. Those were some of the scenes across Gaza last night as jubilation and relief swept the strip following the announcement that Hamas and Israel had agreed to a ceasefire. Today, however, that joy began to look potentially premature. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office announced last night that he was delaying a cabinet vote on the ceasefire and accused Hamas of reneging on aspects of the deal. Now, this is something we have seen many times before. A ceasefire seems to be on the cards only for Israel to pull back by accusing Hamas of changing the terms. Hamas has denied those charges today, saying they're, quote, committed to the ceasefire. And earlier this afternoon, Israeli spokesperson David Mencer gave this press conference.
Families of our hostages have been informed today that Hamas has added further demands that contradict the agreement with the mediators. As of this time, the details of the agreement have not yet been finalized, and the negotiation team is continuing its efforts to reach a solution. The Israeli negotiating team are still in Doha as befits Israel's willingness to finalize the hostage release agreement. Therefore, no official announcement will be made by Israel about the success of these negotiations and the subsequent cabinet meeting until we do not have a finalized agreement. Even last night, the Prime Minister strongly insisted that Hamas fold their last-minute demand to change the deployment of IDF forces in the Philadelphia corridor, so important, so crucial to stop weapons smuggling to Hamas. To be clear, the government of Israel wants to finalize an agreement. We want to bring our people home, and we hope that the details will indeed be finalized.
Now, Mencer wasn't very clear about what the holdup is about, though he did mention the Philadelphia corridor there. So the corridor, which runs along Gaza's border with Egypt, has been a major issue in these negotiations, with Israel previously insisting that it should maintain a military presence within it, effectively controlling Gaza's only external border. That's a condition that Hamas has declared to be unacceptable. The Times of Israel has received a leaked copy of the deal, now confirmed to be authentic. It says this about the Philadelphia corridor. Regarding the Philadelphia corridor, the Gaza-Egypt border, the document says Israeli troops will gradually withdraw during the first stage according to maps agreed upon between both the sides. After the release of the last of the 33 hostages on day 42 of the ceasefire, the end of the first stage, IDF troops will need to begin to complete their withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor at the latest on day 50 during the second stage. So that seems fairly clear, a gradual withdrawal of Israeli troops during the first phase of the deal with completion during the second stage. But a senior Israeli official has now denied that Israel agreed to those terms. According to the Times of Israel, of course, the delay may be more a matter of optics than an actual threat to the deal. An Israeli government source has told the Times of Israel that the holdup is actually over coalition politics in Netanyahu's government. Netanyahu's power relies on the support of two far-right parties that angrily oppose any ceasefire. Israel's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, has demanded that the war continue in Gaza after the hostages are returned and has threatened to quit the government, taking his religious Zionist party with him. The country's national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has also threatened to quit, potentially taking Netanyahu's support from the Jewish Power Party with him. The loss of the two ministers wouldn't be enough to block the ceasefire if the rest of the cabinet agreed to it, but it would mean that Netanyahu loses his parliamentary majority. There's also plenty of opposition to the ceasefire in Israeli society. When the ceasefire was announced yesterday, around 300 Israeli protesters, mostly young men, blocked the main road into Jerusalem in protest, while holding placards saying, quote, "You have no mandate to surrender to Hamas," and "Release of terrorists equals a bloodbath." There were also skirmishes with the police. Meanwhile, hundreds more protesters gathered in central Jerusalem to oppose the ceasefire agreement, carrying banners reading "No mandate to surrender to Hamas." The protesters demanded total victory over Hamas, no humanitarian aid into Gaza, and no prisoner exchanges. One protester told reporters, quote, "Please, President Trump, do not pressure us to give in to Hamas, pressure them to give in to us." Israel may also be trying to save face internationally. It's been widely reported that incoming US President Donald Trump pressed Netanyahu into accepting a ceasefire against his will. And in Israeli spokesperson David Mentz's briefing, there certainly seemed to be a focus on presenting a different image of Israel to the world.
Now, if this agreement to release our hostages is finalized, it will demonstrate Israel's strength, Israel's humanity, and Israel's unwavering commitment to its citizens. This moment has been chosen because of Israel's military and diplomatic strength. Now, this hostage deal, this hostage agreement, if it is finally agreed, is not a concession. It's a demonstration of Israel's strength and moral clarity. Hamas's days are numbered and Gaza will be free from their terror.
Some outlets are now reporting that the Israeli cabinet will meet tomorrow to approve the ceasefire deal. So we'll see where that goes. Helena, what do you make first of the initial ceasefire announcement, but more importantly, of the kind of moves that Israel has made since to delay or stall the possibility of a ceasefire?
Well, one thing's for sure is if this ceasefire deal does hold, I'm going to see a lot less of David Mentzer on my screens, which I think we can all agree is going to be a welcome development in the case of what we've been dealing with over the last 15 months. But regardless, looking at the internal Israeli politics of what's going on here, we're looking at the potential collapse of the coalition. And we all know, we've all seen Netanyahu and his actions over however many years that he's been a political figure within Israel. The single thing that drives a lot of his political ambition outside of his kind of colonial ambitions is its own specific political career. He's a very careerist politician. He will put his own personal ambitions above, broadly, the interests of his own people, or indeed the interests of the people who've been held in Gaza for the last 15 months. So a lot of these people, they come second to his own political ambitions and his political success. The idea that the potential ceasefire agreement, which I think probably is likely to get voted through the cabinet, I don't think it would have gotten to this position with the level to which has been broadcast internationally through like the Qatari Prime Minister giving a press conference on the terms of the deal. I don't think we'd be getting to this point if there wasn't at least some desire from Netanyahu and his fellow members of the cabinet who want to approve the deal of approving the deal. I think that it is more of a delaying tactic and more of a way of trying to project some level of strength that they think that they should be projecting rather than a desire to immediately collapse the deal. That may happen later on. Michael's predictions from yesterday, they may well come true, that after the hostages have been returned after those 42 days, the carnage will resume. But that doesn't preclude the idea that the initial ceasefire deal may be approved by the cabinet, much to the chagrin of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. What that does leave them, though, is a problem in that is going to collapse the coalition, as you said. And that's the one sticking point which leaves me in a lot of doubt over that the strength of what's going on here is that if Netanyahu's political career, which remember, if he loses his protection of being the prime minister, he also therefore has to deal with people's opposition to his judicial reforms, the protests that we were seeing in 2022 and 2023 around his desire to essentially turn Israeli society specifically to his whims. That he'll have to answer to that if he loses power and if he's out of government. But then there's also the point that will Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have any power within Israeli government if they don't have the Likud party to cling to as part of a coalition deal? That might be what keeps them on side and not collapse the coalition government if the ceasefire deal is approved as well. So there's a lot of interesting points of inflection that might necessarily change what Netanyahu's opinion is moving forward. Certainly, I do think people are already broadcasting this idea of Trump being the peace president now, like they're trying to ignore his hawkish past and trying to project him as the guy who got the ceasefire deal done and got the hostages home within American society. That might move him to continue to play hardball with Netanyahu. But again, these are all very, very early moments. We shouldn't be making too many hard and fast predictions just yet. What I would say is that there is still a deep sickness in Israeli society. Those pictures that you saw, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people on the streets of Israel, not just demanding that Hamas as a political or military organization has been removed from Gaza, whether or not you agree that's a good or bad thing. They were far more concerned with things like the idea of not surrendering, the idea of no humanitarian aid into Gaza. These are the same kind of extremists that are commonplace now in Israeli society who are out there trying to block humanitarian aid getting into Gaza, Abba Karem Shalom border crossing as well. It's this exact same ideology that, again, it's a supremacist one that sees Palestinians as not being worthy of things such as, the basic things that they need to be able to survive, such as humanitarian aid. And there is still quite a large section of society who will absolutely oppose if their leader of choice, which is Netanyahu, who represents that side of Israeli society, if he undermines that level of support that he has with them because he is willing to acquiesce to Trump and to the American administration that's incoming and try and find a ceasefire deal so far as we know that that's what the negotiation looks like at the moment, they're going to be very, very angry with the government. And he might lose politically his base of support on top of potentially collapsing his government. So that means that there is quite a lot of potential for this deal to fall through, given how shaky it is already.
The fact that internal machinations or the survival of Netanyahu's political career is determining the fate of 2.5 million Palestinians is unfortunate but true. And it's why within Israeli society, as we've pointed out, Israeli society is not for a ceasefire, but the segment within Israeli society that is most eager to get a ceasefire is actually the families of the hostages. And they have expressed a lot of frustration that in their perception, Netanyahu was continuing this war and not doing the things that would be needed to bring the hostages home, precisely to resuscitate his dying political career. I mean, right before October 7th, his political career was on the brink. He was facing a lot of judicial issues. He was facing internal resistance within Israeli society, nothing to do with the occupation of Palestine, but to do with, internal Israeli politics. And nothing strengthens an ailing politician's political career like a war. But the fact that he has been enabled by the international community to allow those internal machinations to essentially kill at least, with the most conservative estimate, 45,000 Palestinians, is unacceptable and is an indictment of our global political system. But even as news of a ceasefire broke last night, Israel continued to bomb Gaza. Attacks across Gaza have reportedly killed a further 81 Palestinians since the deal was announced. From Gaza City to the Al-Mawasi evacuation zone, those killed were all people who survived 15 months of brutal assaults, only for their lives to be cut short within days of the airstrikes ending. And Palestinians are bracing themselves for further days of carnage ahead of Sunday, when the ceasefire is due to begin. If it goes ahead, we can expect to see Israel release 30 Palestinian detainees for every civilian hostage released by Hamas, and 50 for every female Israeli soldier released. In total, 33 hostages will be released over 42 days. The fighting will also come to a stop, and Israel's forces will move out of populated areas and to the edges of the strip. Meanwhile, displaced Palestinians will begin returning to their home. Now, the terms of the second phase of the deal hasn't yet been agreed, with the two sides expected to negotiate them during the first phase. It will involve the release of any remaining hostages, including male soldiers, in exchange for an as yet not agreed number of Palestinian detainees. It's also expected to involve establishing the conditions that would allow both sides to declare a, quote, sustainable calm. In previous negotiations, that's been taken to mean a permanent end to military and hostile operations. At the moment, we don't know what it would take for each side to agree to such a sustainable calm, or what the terms that each side would have to agree to in order to implement a sustainable calm. And the third phase of the deal largely involves the reconstruction of Gaza, and that's expected to take up to 5 years. But before that can happen, the terms of Gaza's future governance will have to be agreed. In a speech at the Atlantic Council, outgoing US Secretary of State Antony Blinken laid out a plan that he said he'd handed to the incoming Trump administration.
We believe that the Palestinian Authority should invite international partners to help establish and run an interim administration with responsibility for key civil sectors in Gaza like banking, water, energy, health, civil coordination with Israel. The international community would provide funding, technical support, and oversight. The interim administration would include Palestinians from Gaza and representatives from the PA, selected following meaningful consultation with communities in Gaza, and would hand over complete responsibility to a fully reformed PA administration as soon as it's feasible. The administrators would operate in close cooperation with a senior UN official who should oversee the international stabilization and recovery effort. An interim security mission would be made up of members of partner nation security forces and vetted Palestinian personnel. Its responsibilities would include creating a secure environment for humanitarian and reconstruction efforts and ensuring border security, which is crucial to preventing smuggling that could allow Hamas to rebuild its military capacity. We would stand up a new initiative to train, to equip, to vet a PA-led security force for Gaza to focus on law and order and gradually take over for the interim security mission. These arrangements would be enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution. Some of our partners have already expressed their willingness to contribute troops and police for such a mission. But if, and only if, it is agreed that Gaza and the West Bank are reunified under a reformed PA as part of a pathway to an independent Palestinian state. And therein lies the rub. Reaching agreement will require all parties to summon the political will, to make hard decisions, to make hard compromises. Key regional and international actors will need to fully commit to supporting Palestinian-led governance and preventing Hamas's return. The PA will need to carry out swift, far-reaching reform to build more transparent, accountable governance, continuing a process that it began last year. Israel will have to accept reuniting Gaza and the West Bank under the leadership of a reformed PA.
Now, from this point in history, that looks almost completely unachievable. The current Israeli government has no interest in giving up its settlements in the West Bank, and some of its ministers are deeply committed to settling all of it, as well as parts of Gaza. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority is mistrusted by many Palestinians. At the same time, Israel's war on Gaza is reported to have replenished Hamas's ranks, with Blinken saying that the organization had recruited as many soldiers as it had lost. To assess the long-term prospects for a lasting peace in the region, I was joined earlier by Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, president of the Palestinian National Initiative and elected member of the PLO's Central Council. I began by asking him for his reaction to the ceasefire, as well as the hold-up generated by the Israeli side.
Maybe this is the first time the full truth is known to the world, which is that the Palestinians have never been an obstacle to reaching an agreement. And actually, it was all the time Netanyahu and the Israeli government that prevented reaching an agreement. As a matter of fact, I think most of what was agreed about is exactly identical to what was approved back on the 3rd of July. And the Palestinian side and Hamas accepted it. It was Netanyahu who obstructed it, and Biden covered up for Netanyahu and lied, actually. He lied, claiming that Palestinians were the obstacle. Now the whole world can see that the Palestinian side have accepted the deal, have accepted the conditions, even if it didn't like some of these conditions. But Netanyahu is continuing to procrastinate and to maneuver, because for Netanyahu, his own survival, his selfishness is more important than reaching an agreement, and it's even more important than the lives of Israeli captives, many of whom would die, as many have died because of his procrastination for the last 6 months. During the last 6 months, the Israeli army and Netanyahu's government killed 10,000 Palestinian people, mostly civilians, mostly children and women. And also they killed in the process a number of Israeli captives. This is the situation today. And we think the agreement is good. It's not ideal, but it's a good agreement because it will stop the genocide that is happening in Gaza. On the other hand, we think this agreement has happened mainly because of the Palestinian resilience and steadfastness, and because Netanyahu could not achieve his military goals. He could not bring back the Israeli prisoners without by force. He could not conduct the ethnic cleansing he was planning in Gaza, and he could not eliminate the Palestinian resistance there. So, all in all, I think the whole world must now pressure Netanyahu to stop playing games and accept signing this agreement.
Palestinians in Gaza have, of course, suffered unimaginable horrors over the past 15 months. We also had this quite strange intervention from outgoing US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, where he said that Israel's war on the Strip has recruited as many people to Hamas's militias as it has killed. So can we say that in reality, Israel has lost this war?
You can say Israel lost the war in the sense that it didn't achieve its political goals. Every war in the world, regardless of how huge the atrocities are, has a political aim. And the political Israeli aim was to break the Palestinian people, to break the Palestinian resistance, to impose ethnic cleansing. This is something that is not a secret. I think if you read the book of Bob Woodward, War, in which he describes the first encounter between Blinken and Netanyahu told him that his plan is to ethnically cleanse all of Gaza and move the people out to the Sinai Peninsula. This was the Israeli original plan. And they started implementing it. I mean, actually, they erased to the ground 4 cities in the north, including Beit Hanun, Jabalia, and Jabalia camp, and Beit Lahia. And they forced all the population there to be ethnically cleansed. But he failed. They failed to achieve their political goals. The Palestinians paid a very high price. I think more than 70,000 people killed, if we include those who died from terrible diseases and so on. And more than 109,000 injured, at least 11,000 missing under the rubble, at least 18,000 children killed. We paid a very high price. And the people of Gaza heroically steadfasted and stood up to this terrible aggression. They suffered from diseases. They suffered from starvation. You can say 2.2 million people in Gaza are taken hostages. I mean, I am shocked all the time about many Western media outlets who keep talking about the 98 or 99 Israeli hostages, as they call them. But they never say that there are 2.2 million Palestinian people taken hostages by Israeli army and by the Israeli fascist government. They don't talk about the 16,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, including 3,500 who are in jail without knowing why, under the so-called administrative detention. So there is a situation of disregard to Palestinian humanity here. And we're never treated by these media outlets as equal human beings. And that's the reality. And that's why we have to stand up to that and bring in the proper and right narrative. Now, nobody should allow Netanyahu to continue the game, and the truth has to be exposed completely.
We are hoping that the ceasefire will begin on Sunday, but there's, of course, a long road ahead with this three kind of complicated phases of this ceasefire. What are your thoughts on the prospect of these three phases being completed and the ceasefire actually lasting?
The Palestinian resistance insisted on two things all the time. The first thing, that this should be not only a temporary ceasefire, but it should be an agreement about ending the war. Netanyahu didn't want that, of course. But now he's under pressure, not only because there is international pressure on him, but also because he is suffering a lot of losses. Human losses, terrible economic losses. People ask him, what are your political goals from this war? What Blinken spoke about, aggravating practically Netanyahu and the Israeli public, is absolutely shameful. When he speaks about Hamas reorganizing and mobilizing more people, what does he want? He wants Netanyahu to continue the war? Blinken has been the worst ever state secretary of the United States. He should have been the foreign minister of Israel, not the United States. He has a very he established a very bad record that makes him absolutely a participant in the war crimes that happened in Gaza, including the war crime of genocide. So today, I think we are standing in front of a very clear situation. The negotiations that still remain are not between Hamas and Israel. These negotiations have finished. Hamas agreed to the agreement. The negotiations that are happening now are between Netanyahu and Smotrich, between Netanyahu, who is leading a fascist government, and the most extreme fascist in his government, Smotrich, and the other one being Gvir. Netanyahu is playing games with trying to sustain and keep his government, trying to prevent Smotrich from leaving. So he is negotiating with his own ministers. Between us, between the Palestinians and Israel, the negotiations are over. So the problem now is an internal Israeli problem. And if pressure has to be exercised, it has to be exercised on Netanyahu and on his government to initiate this ceasefire, which will not just be a ceasefire. It will be, of course, it will be in 3 stages. But I don't think, I think it would be almost impossible. But everything can happen, of course. But it's impossible, I think, for Israel to reactivate the war again after 3 stages, each of which will be 42 days. I don't think Israel is capable of doing that.
Inshallah, we can say about that. In terms of both Blinken, but also looking ahead, when we're talking about sort of post-war governance now in Palestine, Blinken firstly said that, he wants to see a revamped Palestinian Authority, in Gaza, which seems quite unlikely. But he also said that Israel will have to accept a united Palestine consisting of Gaza and the West Bank. What do you make of that intervention, and does that seem likely to you?
No, it doesn't seem likely, but it's just a slogan. All the countries in the world, including the American government, who keep speaking about 2-state solution and about a Palestinian state, and refuse to recognize the Palestinian state, and don't say that Israeli occupation must end so that there can be a Palestinian state, and don't say that settlements not only have to stop, but that all illegal settlements in the West Bank should be removed completely. If they don't say these 3 things, removal of settlements, end of occupation, and recognition of Palestine, then all their talk about 2-state solution is nothing but hypocrisy. We've seen this hypocrisy going on for more than 40 years now, and we are sick and tired of this hypocrisy. If they really mean it, they should say the 3 other things. Now, what does it mean who should rule Gaza? It's not up to Mr. Blinken. It's not up to Netanyahu. And it's not up even to any regional country to decide how we should run Gaza. Gaza should be run by Palestinians, by ourselves. And we should have, in my opinion, the best solution is to implement what we agreed about in Beijing, something that all Palestinian 14 parties have signed, the agreement of Beijing, which says that there will be a national consensus government that would be in charge of West Bank and Gaza Strip, maintaining the unity of Gaza and West Bank, preventing separation of Gaza from West Bank, preventing continuation of Israeli occupation of Gaza, and preventing these horrible plans that came from the office of Elliot Abrams and other most extreme American diplomats, which wants to create a trust to run Gaza and to bring foreign troops. I mean, as if one Israeli occupation is not enough, they want to bring another occupation from other countries. To deny us the right to self-govern, the right to be in charge of ourselves. The solution is national consensus government that should immediately start preparing for free democratic elections in Palestine. We did not have elections since 20 years. The last presidential elections happened 20 years ago. The last legislative council elections took place 19 years ago. We have the right to have elections. We have the right to democratically and freely choose our leaders. And nobody should prevent us from doing that. If Americans choose their leader, if French people choose their leader, then Palestinians have the right to choose their leaders, and nobody has the right to object to what we choose. Can any country in the world now tell the United States of America, we don't like Trump, so we don't accept to deal with Trump? Of course not. So what we need is one standard in a world that is dominated, unfortunately, today by double standards. The key to the future of Gaza, which needs a lot of good work to help people to reconstruct, to rebuild our health structures that Israel destroyed, to rebuild our hospitals, our schools, to rebuild our infrastructure. Gaza now is without electricity, without clean water, without sewage systems. Gaza in terrible shape. And that needs a unified Palestinian structure that could unify all the efforts of all Palestinians, and most importantly, that can stand up to the Israeli Zionist plans that probably get the support of many people in Trump's administration of annexing the West Bank and Judaizing the West Bank and killing the very last opportunity for a Palestinian state. We need Palestinian efforts to be unified, to stand up to these plans. And the best approach, the best entry point here is the application and implementation of Beijing Agreement.
That was Mustafa Barghouti speaking to me earlier today. Now that a ceasefire has been at least tentatively announced, political leaders are lining up to take credit for ending a situation they largely created. At a press conference announcing the agreement, President Biden said this.
Good afternoon. It's a very good afternoon, because at long last, I can announce a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached between Israel and Hamas. For more than 15 months of conflict that began with Hezbollah's brutal massacre on October the 7th, more than 15 months of terror for the hostages, their families, the Israeli people, more than 15 months of suffering by the innocent people of Gaza. Fighting in Gaza will stop, and soon the hostages will return home to their families. The elements of this deal were what I laid out in detail this past May, which was embraced by countries around the world and endorsed overwhelmingly by the UN Security Council. The deal is structured in 3 phases. Phase 1 will last 6 weeks. It includes a full and complete ceasefire, withdrawal of Israeli forces from all the populated areas of Gaza, and the release of a number of hostages held by Hamas, including women and elderly and the wounded. And I'm proud to say Americans will be part of that hostage release in phase 1 as well. And the Vice President and I cannot wait to welcome them home. In exchange, Israel released hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. And during phase 1, the Palestinians can also return to their neighborhoods in all the areas of Gaza. and the surge of humanitarian assistance into Gaza will begin, and the innocent people can have greater access to these vital supplies. You know, during the next 6 weeks, Israel will negotiate the necessary arrangements to get phase 2, which is a permanent end of the war. Let me say it again, a permanent end of the war. There are a number of details to negotiate to move from phase 1 to phase 2, but the plan says if negotiations take longer than 6 weeks, the ceasefire will continue as long as the negotiations continue. I've spoken to the Emir of Kuwait and the President of Egypt, and we have pledged to make sure the negotiations will keep moving forward for as long as it takes. Then, when phase 2 begins, there will be an exchange for release of the remaining living hostages, including male soldiers, and all remaining Israeli forces will be withdrawn from Gaza, and the temporary ceasefire will become permanent. And finally, phase 3, any final remains of hostages who have been killed will be returned to their families, and a major reconstruction plan for Gaza will begin. This is the ceasefire agreement I introduced last spring. Today, Hamas and Israel have agreed to that ceasefire agreement.
It's hard not to notice there barely any recognition of the scale of damage wrought in Gaza, let alone who the perpetrator of that devastation was. In his classic brand of online self-aggrandizement, Trump also took to Truth Social to claim that it was in fact his November election victory that secured the deal, stating, "This epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of our historic victory in November, as it signaled to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans and our allies. I'm thrilled American and Israeli hostages will be returning home to be reunited with their families and loved ones. With this deal in place, my national security team, through efforts of Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, will continue to work closely with Israel and our allies to make sure Gaza never again becomes a terrorist safe haven. We will continue promoting peace through strength," that was all in capitals, by the way, "throughout the region as we build upon the momentum of this ceasefire to further expand the historic Abraham Accords. This is only the beginning of great things to come for America and indeed the world. We have achieved so much without even being in the White House. Just imagine all of the wonderful things that will happen when I return to the White House and my administration is fully confirmed so they can secure more victories for the United States." It's always really hard to read a Trump statement because the grammar is just all over the place. Anyway, if all that wasn't quite tasteless enough for your liking, one reporter put the question of who takes credit to Biden himself.
Who does the history books credit for this, Mr. President, you or Trump?
Is that a joke? Oh, thank you. Thanks, sir.
Nice to see the Americans keeping it classy, as usual. Although our own British politicians certainly are not off the hook. Keir Starmer, who has spent the past 15 months nodding along and robotically repeating, "We stand with Israel," even when asked whether Israel had the right to cut off water and electricity to Gaza, gave this statement last night. "After months of devastating bloodshed and countless lives lost, this is the long overdue news that the Israeli and Palestinian people have desperately been waiting for. They have borne the brunt of this conflict, triggered by the brutal terrorists of Hamas, who committed the deadliest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust on October 7th, 2023. The hostages, who were brutally ripped from their homes on that day and held captive in unimaginable conditions ever since, can now finally return to their families. But we should also use this moment to pay tribute to those who won't make it home, including the British people who were murdered by Hamas. We will continue to mourn and remember them. For the innocent Palestinians whose homes turned into a war zone overnight, and many who have lost their lives, this ceasefire must allow for a huge surge in humanitarian aid, which is so desperately needed to end the suffering in Gaza. And then our attention must turn to how we secure a permanently better future for the Israeli and Palestinian people, grounded in a two-state solution that will guarantee security and stability for Israel alongside a sovereign and viable Palestine state. The The UK and its allies will continue to be at the forefront of these crucial efforts to break the cycle of violence and secure long-term peace in the Middle East. That last paragraph, the UK and its allies will continue to be at the forefront of efforts to break the cycle of violence, is particularly galling to me, given that it was the British mandate of Palestine in 1917 that began this cycle of violence. Again, much like Biden's statement, we see a complete imbalance in how seriously the death and trauma of Israelis is taken compared to that of the Palestinians. Both statements began with a full and humanizing and empathic account of what happened to the Israeli hostages and how that impacted their families and Israeli society as a whole. Both statements name Hamas as the aggressor, as the cause of devastation on, quote, both sides. And then is this tokenistic footnote buried deep into both statements is a bland reference to the suffering in Gaza without any acknowledgement of who has caused that suffering. If anything, they just blame Hamas for the suffering in Gaza, even though it is, of course, Israeli snipers, Israeli fighter jets, and Israeli bombs that have been raining down on the Strip for the past 15 months. In both statements, Palestinians have quite literally become a footnote in their own genocide. To discuss this further, I spoke earlier to Dalia Abul-Hajj, a Palestinian lawyer from Jerusalem who also works as a senior legal officer at the International Centre for Justice for Palestinians in London. I began by asking her reaction to the news of a ceasefire.
We're definitely filled with relief that this is something that is going to happen. However, it is definitely a lot of mixed emotions that it has taken 15 months for this ceasefire to be achieved. We believe that there is no way that this ceasefire would hold if there aren't three things that are upheld. Firstly, there needs to be humanitarian aid immediately without hindrance from Israel allowed in. And secondly, there needs to be accountability for all the crimes that we have seen in Gaza over the past 15 months. Palestinians have lost so much. And thirdly, and most importantly, there needs to be the will from the international community to allow the Palestinian people to practice their right to self-determination, because without that, we're going to be seeing is these scenes over and over again. Palestinians do deserve to achieve their right to self-determination. They do deserve an everlasting peace and justice to be served to them.
Absolutely. So we've heard statements from Biden, from Starmer, Trump, and of course from the Israeli government and from Hamas responding to the ceasefire announcement. What do you make of these initial responses from these political figures?
I think the answer is straightforward, and it doesn't really matter who these political figures are or where they are. The main thing is that what has allowed for this genocide to keep going for 15 months is the complicity of all of those in political power and all of those that had decision-making powers, whether it is the White House, the Biden administration that we've seen over and over supporting Israel with weapons and financial aid, whether it's the UK government that has been also directly complicit in Israel's genocide against Palestinians in Gaza by supporting Israel with F-35 components and other types of military aid. And all other European leaders who have allowed for this to keep going. It is definitely a failure on their end for this genocide to keep happening for 15 months, 466 days of unimaginable losses for Palestinians, 66% of the infrastructure destroyed, a decimated medical infrastructure. So many people lost their lives, tens of thousands of Palestinians injured, and so many more tragedies that we can't even begin to count.
Speaking of that question of complicity, part of your role is, as a lawyer, is gathering evidence for the ICJ and the ICC cases against Israel, which include, of course, charges of genocide. now there is a ceasefire, we can expect to find out even more about what Israel has been doing in the Strip for the past 15 months. What do you think this means for political leaders who have stood beside Israel's actions for the past year and a bit?
It's very important to understand that the work now is more important than ever. Obviously, for the past 15 months, ICJP and myself as a lawyer at the organization, we've been collecting evidence about the genocidal acts and the war crimes that have been committed by Israel. We've delivered that evidence to the ICC and the South Africa's legal team before the ICJ. And we're also aware that this evidence has been used and has been relied on in these cases. But now the work is more demanding. We're going to be seeing a lot of crimes unfolding, things that we haven't been aware of that happened on the ground because there was no way to know what was happening on the ground. And for that, there will be a lot of legal work that would aim to hold these politicians that were complicit in either providing material aid or even moral support to Israel in continuing with its crimes against the Palestinians. But what needs to happen as well is that we need to see a shift in the world now. We need to see more respect for international courts and international institutions in upholding their mandates and actually being able to uphold the international rules-based order. This is very important now. This international rules-based order, these courts were established for specifically what has happened over the past 15 months, and in order to ensure that these crimes and massacres are not committed over and over and over. So what we need to see, firstly, is Israeli perpetrators held to account before these institutions without any interference by other governments or states, and without any bullying tactics used against these institutions. And what we also need to see is intensified efforts on all domestic levels in different jurisdictions to hold accountable politicians that have supported so long Israeli actions and Israeli politicians in their crimes against Palestinians.
What does that accountability, both for Israel and also for the enablers of Israel, what does accountability for them look like to you?
Accountability definitely means having the Israeli perpetrators stand before a court of law and answer in accordance with the law to the crimes that they have committed. And if there is sufficient evidence, and there is sufficient evidence that has been live streamed on our phones day in, day out throughout this genocide, to indict them of these crimes, and also to indict political leaders of complicity for their crimes, as well for being complicit and aiding and abetting Israel in its crimes. But that accountability also takes different forms. Palestinians need to be able to realize their right to self-determination. And that means that Israel's occupation must come to an end. The siege on Gaza must be brought to an end. It must be lifted. Humanitarian aid needs to be let in. Palestinians need to be able to have their own leadership. Palestinians need to be allowed to practice their rights and have the same rights that everyone else around the world has. They need to have access to reparations for the losses that they've endured. And honestly, I think it's impossible to provide reparations for Palestinians in comparison with the losses that they've endured. What we've seen and what we will be seeing unfolding in the upcoming few months, if not years, is the unimaginable loss of the Palestinians, of their sons, of their family members, of their limbs, of their houses, their livelihoods. There's so much, but let's start from holding these Israeli officials and Western politicians accountable for their aiding and abetting of this genocide.
It, of course, goes without saying that neither Biden, Trump, nor Starmer can take full credit for the ceasefire agreement. If there's anything they can take credit for, it's providing the financial, military, and political resources for Israel to drop over 85,000 tons of explosives on the tiny strip, killing at least 46,000 people in Gaza. That's 1 in every 50. Injuring over 100,000 and plunging 2.2 million into acute food insecurity. That's not to mention the unimaginable scale of psychological trauma and infrastructural damage, which experts say will take at least a decade to rebuild. When it comes to who can take credit for this ceasefire, it's the millions of people worldwide who have protested, petitioned, and boycotted, the organizers and lawyers who have taken Israel through the court system, and of course, above all, the population of Gaza themselves, who have insisted on life and cared for one another in the most brutal conditions imaginable. We're going to end this segment with a clip of a woman in Gaza who outlines this really beautifully. The clip is in Arabic with subtitles, but for those listening with just audio, you're going to hear my voice reading a translation. We will clear the rubble, rebuild and restore. Gaza will return better than ever. There is a little girl, a martyr's daughter, her sister, and many others. There are elders and young men. All of us will rebuild it. Gaza will be more beautiful than before. Gaza is within us. We are the ones who endured. We are the ones who persevered. No achievements are owed to anyone. No leader, no official, no country. This achievement is ours, mine, hers, and theirs. We take pride that we endured and made it through. May you be blessed. For 466 days, Palestinians in Gaza have been bombed, starved, shot, and routinely injured. At least 47,000 have been killed, with that number likely to be a significant underestimate given the collapse of Gaza's medical infrastructure. And yet, who knew that the real agony was being felt here in the UK, in Tottenham to be precise? This was Foreign Secretary David Lammy's reaction to the ceasefire. This is a moment of hope after over a year of agony. All phases of the deal must be implemented in full, and we must establish a pathway to lasting peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. My statement on the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. So let's just take a closer look at David Lammy's year of agony. At the beginning of Israel's assault on Gaza, he spent his time trying to justify the country's worst offences.
It's clear to me that it's wrong to bomb a refugee camp. But clearly, if there is a military objective, it can be legally justifiable. It's for Israel to explain its actions.
In February, when the SNP tabled a vote on a ceasefire motion in the House of Commons, this was Lammy's response.
I haven't seen the motion. It's not yet put down. We will scrutinise that motion, as is our way in Parliament. That will come in on Monday, I suspect, Tuesday, and we will take it from there. But look, let us be clear. Yes, we will have a vote in Parliament this week, but it's not that vote that will bring about a ceasefire. It's the diplomatic action. It's Hamas. It's Benjamin Netanyahu. It's Partners for Peace saying the fighting must now stop.
David Lammy, the motion's actually been published already, and we've got it here. The SNP motion says this House calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. It notes with shock and distress that the death toll has now risen beyond 28,000. That is the motion. It is crystal clear. Will Labour vote for it?
Well, look, I've seen that swirling around social media, but that's not a motion. That's just a form of words swirling around social media. And I don't think that was the entirety that you read out.
And when it came to the vote, Lammy was clear about his priorities.
I don't want to do anything in an election year in which the Labour Party might have the privilege of serving that cuts across our ability to do that. And if you look at the detail of that SNP motion, it's not balanced. And that is the problem as I see it with the SNP motion.
In April of last year, while still in opposition, Lammy said this about arms sales to Israel.
I have now been calling for 12 days for David Cameron to publish the legal advice so that we are clear on whether Israel has contravened international humanitarian law and therefore arms sales should be suspended. All of the British public can see the scenes coming out of Gaza, children lying in rubble, deep concerns being made about international human rights law. And for all of those reasons, that advice should be published. And if it is the case that international law has been contravened, then it's absolutely right that offensive arms are suspended to Israel. This has happened in the past. It happened under the Margaret Thatcher administration, and it happened under Gordon Brown's administration. So there is precedent, but it's important now that that advice is published, and so that we can all be clear that if there has been a breach in international humanitarian law, and I must say that I do have very serious concerns, that arms sales are suspended.
But in September, just a few months later, Lammy had changed his tune. Forced by independent legal advice, Lammy agreed to ban just some arms exports to Israel.
It is with regret that I inform the House today the assessment I have received leaves me unable to conclude anything other than that for certain UK arms exports to Israel, there does exist a clear risk that might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. I have informed my right honourable friend, the Business and Trade Secretary, and he is therefore today announcing the suspension of around 30 from a total of approximately 350 to Israel as required under the Export Controls Act.
Now, that was about 10% of all our exports, and it didn't touch the F-35 parts we provide to keep Israeli warplanes in the air. And in July last year, this was one of David Lammy's first acts as Foreign Secretary.
We want a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution, a safe and secure Israel along a viable, sovereign Palestinian state. We're committed to recognising a Palestinian state as a contribution to a peace process at a time that's most conducive to that process.
That's right. He refused to recognise the existence of a Palestinian state. Then, in October, Lammy took part in this exchange in Parliament.
Comments from the benches opposite that suggest that Israel is somehow conducting a war of annihilation, extermination, and of genocide. There is obviously much suffering in Gaza, and we all accept that. But this terminology is completely inappropriate, not accurate, and is repeated by the protesters and the lawbreakers who are intimidating British Jews, as we saw again this weekend. So will the Foreign Secretary take this opportunity to say that there is not a genocide occurring in the Middle East?
These are quite properly legal terms that must be determined by international courts. But I do agree with the honourable gentleman. Those terms were largely used when millions of people lost their lives in crises like Rwanda, the Second World War and the Holocaust. And the way that they are used now undermines the seriousness of that term.
So the British Foreign Secretary thinks he has the power to define genocide in whatever way best suits him politically. In November last year, Lammy was bodied by her UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese.
Excuse me, I can't believe that. He's a lawyer, isn't he?
Yes, a human rights lawyer.
All right. I'm surprised. The first instinct of a lawyer would be to look at the legal documents, the jurisprudence, and probably David Lammy has to explain to the public where did he read that is the number of people killed who define genocide. Probably David Lammy should read Article 2.4 of the Genocide Convention, which refers to an act of genocide that doesn't even involve the killing of one person. Really? But excuse me, what constitutes genocide is established by Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, not personal opinion.
And even though Lammy appears to have done the absolute bare minimum to bring about the end of the genocide in Gaza, he was pretty happy to pitch himself as a key player in bringing about the recent ceasefire.
Look, it was right that the two countries with proximity to Hamas, Egypt and Qatar, alongside the United States with its special relationship with Israel, led these discussions. But of course, it's also been important that we used all diplomatic effort to achieve this. That's why I've been to Israel 3 times in the last 6 months. That's why I'm on the phone every week to all of the major actors. That's why we're committed £100 million worth of British taxpayers' money to the humanitarian effort in Gaza. And we want to see that aid now get in. And that's why, of course, we've been leading the charge on behalf of those hostages that have UK links. This peace that may now have been achieved is very fragile. This is just phase 1. We must move to phase 2 and 3 and a complete ceasefire and the day after. And as you would expect, the United Kingdom will be playing a critical role, both in the humanitarian effort and in those steps to begin to rebuild Gaza, but to get to the 2-state solution that will see wider peace between Israel and the Palestinian people.
Helena, on a scale of angry to furious, how do you feel watching David Lammy flip-flopping between all those positions?
I mean, I was both angry and furious at him 15 months ago and for the periods after that. But at this point, I'm totally numb. I'm just totally numb to British politicians just being completely lacking in all principles. And is there anyone who's a better example of the lack of principles in our elected politicians than David Lammy, the most unprincipled sellsword in British politics, who cannot find a single principle and stick to it? He cannot have an ideological position that he will hold dear, or indeed any kind of morality or ethics as a position that he holds dear to himself. He will sell these. He will give these positions up, regardless of where that might leave him politically or internationally, if it means it thinks that he will help his own political career. As far as I'm concerned, from everything that I've seen from him thus far. Of course, we have seen many instances of his own personal hypocrisy from those little clips that you've just shown there. But if you go back, right, you go back to 2018, during the Great March of Return, he was very vociferous in saying that these were massacres of Palestinians by the Israeli government, by the IDF. He explicitly tweeted out, calling them massacres, and he was right to do so. He can't use that same terminology right now. They died, they've lost their lives. No, they were massacred by Israel, and they were massacred back then too. He even said to Theresa May at the time that it would be bending the knee to Trump and to hold his hand, metaphorically, like she did physically when she met Trump at the White House. And that was very vociferous language towards Donald Trump. Good, that's what we like to see, vociferous language towards Trump and in defense of the Palestinian people. Yet, now he is currently the foreign secretary. Suddenly, when it comes to Israel, of course, he's been very much happy to continue to give them the quote-unquote benefit of the doubt, even though it's something that shouldn't be given to them at all, given what we've seen on our own phones and the things that they have done over the last 15 months. And when it comes to Donald Trump, suddenly he's turned on a dime. Trump was very nice to me. He bought me 2 dinners, he was saying in an interview to Shahab Khan at ITV. To which, of course, the response was, well, you'll change your mind over a political leader if they buy you dinner? This man is staggeringly unprincipled. It just beggars belief watching this man switch positions. And also very interesting to see, he was a member of Labour Friends of Palestine right up until 2019. Suddenly, it's actually, we've got the sensible grown-ups in charge of the Labour Party. Well, I can't look too pro-Palestine now, can I? So immediately is not a member throughout the 2019 to 2024 Parliament, when he's looking to angle towards a position within the shadow cabinet for people like Keir Starmer. And suddenly now he's foreign secretary. There's Israeli lobbyist money on the line, potentially, should he change his position and be more friendly with Israel and have meetings with the Israeli ambassador, who, as people know, I have a very low opinion of, who've watched this channel for quite a long time. I should be angry. I should continue to be angry at him. And I think you can probably get the anger is still there in my voice. But at this point, I have 0% surprise. I do not expect this man to hold a single position and stick to it, because he has clearly shown, as has been evidenced over the last 15 months, that he will never hold any principal positions. And all that matters to him, as far as I can see, in my personal opinion from the actions that he's taken, that fundamentally is the case. This political career is more important to him than the rule of law, than human life of the people in Palestine, for example, over his potential favour that he can curry with people who are pro-Israel, which, to be fair, are vanishingly small in this society. But people keep trying to say, well, they have to say these things, otherwise it can be politically damaging for them as a political party within Labour, Lammy and Keir Starmer alike. They have to toe the pro-Israel line, otherwise it could be politically damaging for them. Well, we've covered it over and over and over and over again on this channel. The people in the UK are not pro-Israel. They are pro-Palestine. The sympathies, Palestine win or either side wins, much more about people who are sympathetic to specifically Israel. The British public has massively been in support of the arms embargo, a total arms embargo, not this wishy-washy 10% nonsense that we've gotten from David Lammy in the past 7 months. And they have been pro-sanctions on Israeli war criminals, and indeed being far more vociferous in their calls for the removal of things like settlements in the West Bank. And this man has fallen short of the yardsticks that not just the pro-Palestine people that, like we are over here on the left, who've been vociferously pro-Palestine, have wanted him to support, but now the British public in plurality, and in majority in most cases, now supports as well. And the only thing that fills that gap, that bridges that divide between public opinion and his actions, is that there are other interests at play, whether it's political careerism or the interests of the Labour Party and their lobby at large.
David Lammy's constituency that he's talking to is not Tottenham, it's not Britain, it's, the people that can, this man wants to be Prime Minister. That's ultimately his goal. And he does everything that he needs to do, that he thinks he needs to do in order to make it there. And it's also worth saying that not only has he not lived up to the principles that he has previously articulated, I can even forgive that, once you get into power, you can't hold on to every single position that you might have had before you were in power, that there are different interests at play, whatever. Even if I can accept that, he is actually not even gone as far as David Cameron went when he was Foreign Secretary. When David Cameron was Foreign Secretary, he not only placed a ban on what he called extremist Israeli settlers coming into Britain, but he was also considering doing sanctions against what he would quote extreme members of the Israeli government. I believe Ben-Gvir and Smotrich were part of that. And when Lammy introduced the bill or introduced the measures to sanction these so-called extremist West Bank Israeli settlers, he didn't even go as far as David Cameron to also condemn the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir within that. So he's not even reaching the bar of the status quo. And that's what's just so shameful about it. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has announced plans for a series of local inquiries into child sexual exploitation across the country, often referred to as grooming gangs.
To ask all chief constables to look again at historic gang exploitation cases where no further action was taken, and to work with the Police Child Sexual Exploitation Task Force to pursue new lines of inquiry and reopen investigations where appropriate. And these new measures will be backed by $2 million additional funding for the task force and the panel.
The plans include extending the remit of the Police Child Sexual Exploitation Task Force to include all cases since 2013, as well as providing them with an extra £2 million of funding. The inquiries as a whole will receive £10 million of funding. Cooper also confirmed the government will implement the remaining recommendations from the 2022 Child Abuse Inquiry, which includes producing problem profiles on exploitation in different areas. Now, you don't need me to tell you that a major emphasis in this case is, of course, the idea that grooming gangs are a specific problem of Asian men targeting young white girls. The right in particular have claimed that police and other officials covered up the scale of child sexual exploitation for fear of inflaming racial tensions or because of political correctness gone mad. The main inquiry, however, so far into grooming gangs was the J Report, published in 2014, which investigated child sexual exploitation in Birmingham. The report actively saw evidence for the claims that cover-ups were related to fear of stoking racial tensions. However, it didn't find any concrete evidence to support this, emphasizing that there is no simple link between race and child sexual exploitation, and across the UK, the greatest perpetrators of CSE are white men. The report stated that the failure to take action against the abuse was primarily motivated by gender and class prejudice amongst police and social workers, as well as insufficient infrastructures for women and girls facing gender-based violence. It found that when the girls, who were largely working class and many of them were in social care, when they came forward, they were not taken seriously by authorities. Instead, police referred to them, and these are quotes from the report, as risk-fueled, asking for it, and prostituting themselves. This victim blaming is a common thread women and young girls report when trying to seek recourse and justice for violence committed against them. Still, this new inquiry, to be led by Dame Louise Casey, will actively look at, quote, ethnicity data and demographics of gangs involved and their victims, as well as cultural and societal drivers. It is, of course, of utmost importance that this heinous violence is seriously investigated and measures are put in place to ensure this does not continue happening in any institution or any part of this country. But is there a risk here that by focusing so intently on trying to prove a link between race and child abuse, we might actually miss the root cause of the problem? Is there a risk that by only focusing on this one version of this violence, we are missing the bigger problem of systemic misogyny that exists across all levels of British society? And is there an issue that the police, one of the institutions that have been found to chronically mishandle the victims of these kinds of crimes, will be leading the charge in investigating it? Child sexual exploitation is a serious problem that exists in so many corners of society, and it deserves a serious and rigorous approach rooted in actually trying to solve the problem, rather than being the latest football kicked about in our increasingly toxic and enduring culture wars, or to satisfy the likes of Elon Musk and other figures who have been opportunistically weighing in over the past few months. Helena, what do you make of Yvette Cooper's announcements today?
The issue, I think that the biggest problem that's politically in what's happening here is that the people who are currently calling for a new inquiry, I'm not saying that this is the majority of them or whether this is somehow a common theme amongst all of them, but there's a very large percentage of the people who are calling for a new inquiry who are not doing this because they have like a specific desire to see justice for women and girls who are victims of violence, because we already have a J report. We already have loads of different procedures going through government right now, especially to deal with the fact that we need to be tackling violence against women and girls at its root, at its source, right? Having root and branch reform of the judiciary and our process when so few rapes overall achieve any sort of charge, let alone a conviction, where it becomes de facto legal in this country. That they don't want to see justice for these people. What they want is to change the narrative on this so that they can find a causal link between race and the attacks that have been happening. But that's what they're looking for. They want to prove themselves right, that what their understanding of this is, when they've looked at it, when they've seen the skewed perception of who does what or perpetrates what based upon racial lines, they want to prove that link. That's what they want the study for. They want some kind of empirical backing for saying, well, it's Pakistani men that are the problem. It's Pakistani men that are the problem, rather than a societal misogyny, as you said before. So I think that there is a level to which they're being a little bit disingenuous by talking about how we're failing the women and girls by not having this specific new inquiry, when I said we already have an inquiry into this. And that's where Labour have been tripped up by this, because they politically are in a difficult position. I think they do have to do something now because of the level of discourse there is at the moment. And of course, there are loads of Labour MPs who have called for some kind of new inquiry, who are in seats or are in positions in which they are legislators or they are currently representing people who are part of those towns where a lot of these incidents that are famous have happened. Andy Burnham specifically is the mayor of Greater Manchester. Like, within his remit falls both Oldham and Rochdale. So it's difficult for him to oppose anything because like this, because it will be politically damaging for them not to do so. So they're in an invidious position. But the way they framed it to try and find a link between the race and the societal culture and the acts that happened, you can do that overall level of analysis if you really want. But the way they've chosen, so we're going to choose these 5 cases and then try and find a link, well, what you're going to do is have a skewed sample. If you choose the sample of the famous instances, which usually have a racial bias to them already because of the kind of thing that gets reported on, we don't want to talk about classism. We don't want to talk about misogyny. We don't want to talk about internal corruption, especially not in our beloved police force. But they do want to talk about race, especially in the way in which the media has hyped up certain cases in this instance, especially when we already have data that has been skewed on the definition of what counts as CSE, what counts as a quote-unquote grooming gang. Ella Cobain's done really good work exposing how the ways in which that we define which is a different kind of CSE, that can lead to this kind of disparity in what is the perceived racial makeup of the people who commit these crimes. And if they go down that route where you have chosen these specific areas, well, then you're already getting sample bias. You are getting sample bias saying, well, these 5 cases, and then, well, if they're all the Pakistani cases that are famous, then that's going to overrepresent them in the data rather than the broad scale of CSE as it happens overall in this country. And that's going to be a problem. Because there was a really interesting moment on Piers Morgan Uncensored, where he was debating with Mehdi Hassan over this issue. And Mehdi Hassan was like, well, if I take these other cases here, which show that there is group CSE being done by white people, but you don't pay attention to these. And Piers Morgan's like, well, we're concentrating on these cases now. Well, you're concentrating on them because they have a racial dynamic that is good for your narrative. If we took the wider scale of all of the endemic problems with CSE and with VAWG in this country, that would be reasonable to have an inquiry or an investigation into the broad nature of this without engaging in that sample bias. But again, that's not what Piers Morgan wants. He didn't want to talk about the white people who do CSE because it fails to pin down the point that is not, I guess, maybe not good for his political positions, but I think that's less for him than it is the views that he gets. It's the clickbait of saying Pakistani men. Yet when white people do these things, is it ever their race that's the primary reason as to why they've been doing it? No. So I think there is a difficult political position where Labour have probably been forced to acquiesce into this, but the way this is structured seems really, really poor for me, that it's focusing on race rather than focusing on a holistic analysis of how these things came to pass the way that they did.
For me, what concerns me about this is that if you are doing an investigation where you have already decided what the finding is before you conduct the investigation, then you're not doing an investigation. And that to me is the main thing that concerns me. And also, as you mentioned, Helena, there is a problem here where, grooming gangs is being separated from the broader problem of systemic child sexual exploitation. It's being separated as a crime almost, as a unique kind of crime. And the thing that makes it unique, the thing that makes it different is nothing to do with the actual particularities of the sexual violence taking place, the systemic nature of it, but it's the race of the perpetrators. And so is it that it only gets classified as a grooming gang case when the perpetrators aren't white? In which case, well, you've kind of you've created a situation where only one, then you can only say that grooming gangs is an exclusively Asian problem because from the beginning you've defined it as an Asian problem because you've said the main identifier of a grooming gang is if the perpetrators are Asian. And also my problem with this focus on on exceptionalizing Pakistani perpetrators of child sexual exploitation as being uniquely horrific, it also kind of creates this weird dynamic where you're saying that, if you're a victim of sexual exploitation, you have experienced a more harsh trauma or somehow something worse has happened to you if the person who perpetrated it against you is Pakistani versus if someone who perpetrated it against you is white. I mean, it then means that people who are victims of child sexual exploitation and their story doesn't fit neatly into the political paradigm that Elon Musk and the right-wing press and Kemi Badenoch and all of these people have set up, because ultimately what they want to say is black and brown people are dangerous and they shouldn't be allowed in, or they shouldn't have the same, they should be surveilled and policed more. The people victims whose stories don't fall into that narrative that they want, so they're just completely invisible. Like that, what happened to them is not as serious as what happened to others. I mean, it's so ironically, it is itself a deeply misogynistic framing that unfortunately, as you've said, Helena, over the process of many, many years, it was Nick Griffin who first said in 2007, I think it was, that, Asian men are raping women and it's part of their plan to conquer countries. And in the sort of over 10 years that have followed since he made that statement, that talking point of, conquering countries and tying it to this idea of a national security threat rather than a problem of structural misogyny, a form of misogyny, failings by the police, failings by the fact that we don't have a victim-centered infrastructure for people who experience sexual violence. That failure, which runs through all sexual exploitation and all sexual violence cases, the conversation has been moved away from that and into the explanations provided by the likes of Nick Griffin, which now unfortunately has found its way to the absolute centre of British politics. Thank you so much, Helena, for bearing with us and for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me. As always, it's an absolute pleasure to be with Novara, and a special absolute pleasure to be there with you, Dalia.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us and for bearing with us today, for watching this evening. I've been your host, Dalia Gebrial. Make sure you come back tomorrow, the same time, live for tomorrow's episode of Novara. You've been watching Novara Media. I got right to the end of it. Good night.